The clacking of heels echoed through the marble floors of the mansion before a small object crashed against the wall with a dull thud. How many times had she been told not to touch his things? Derek Lawson paused in the doorway to the living room, his keys still in hand. His board meeting had wrapped up 2 hours earlier than expected, so he decided to surprise his family with an early return on Friday afternoon. But what he saw froze him in place. Emilia, his 8-year-old stepdaughter, was huddled in the corner of the room, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a shattered vase. Blood stained her knee where a small cut was still oozing. His wife, Isabella, stood over the girl, her face twisted with an expression of pure contempt. "Do you know how much that vase cost?" Isabella hissed, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at Emilia. "More than your mother earns in an entire year cleaning this house." Derek had known Emilia since she was a toddler. Maria, his first wife, had worked as a maid in the mansion for nearly a decade, even before he remarried. The girl had always been polite, curious, and sharp-witted. She often came with her mother during school breaks, and Derek had always enjoyed the girl's company. "Please, Mrs. Isabella." Emilia's voice trembled. "I was just trying to help clean up. The vase slipped when I heard a loud noise on the TV." "Liar!" Isabella shouted, raising her hand as though to strike Emilia. At that moment, something inside Derek snapped. It wasn't just anger. He had a sudden clarity about the woman he had married, a stark realization of who she truly was. For 3 years, Isabella had been the picture-perfect wife in Derek's eyes, polite, elegant, always saying the right things at social events. But now, with no guests around and only the defenseless child before her, her true nature was revealed. "Isabella." Derek's voice was icy and firm. She turned toward him quickly, her expression morphing into one of feigned surprise. "Derek, darling, I didn't hear you come in. Emilia here just broke the Ming vase you gave me as a wedding gift." Derek stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the scene before him. Emilia crouched low, the blood on her knee, her body language speaking volumes. This wasn't a mere accident, it was a pattern. His business meetings had trained him to read body language, and the look he saw in Emilia's eyes told him she was all too familiar with this type of situation. "Emilia," Derek said softly, his focus now entirely on the girl. "Are you hurt?" The little girl glanced nervously between Derek and Isabella before she nodded timidly. "Where's your mother?" Derek asked gently. "She went to the market to buy supplies," Emilia replied in a barely audible voice. Derek knelt down to her level, making sure to keep his distance, not wanting to scare her further. "How long has Isabella been speaking to you like this when I'm not home?" The silence that followed was louder than any words Emilia could have said. Isabella cleared her throat, uncomfortable. "Derek, you're overreacting. It was just an accident. I was simply telling her to be more careful." Derek didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on Emilia. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. There was something in the way she held herself, like a child who had learned to anticipate danger, to hide the truth just to avoid the wrath of an adult. "Has she been harsh with you before?" Derek asked softly. Emilia glanced at Isabella, then lowered her eyes. The answer was written all over her face. Derek felt his stomach churn. The woman he had married was not the person he thought she was. Isabella seemed to sense his dawning realization, and her social mask began to crack. Her expression twisted for a split second, revealing the same contempt she had shown Emilia moments before. But she quickly replaced it with a look of innocent confusion. Derek saw it all, the cruel look in her eyes, the way she shifted her posture, how carefully she chose her words. This was not the woman he had shared his life with for 3 years. "Emilia," Derek said, his voice gentle, "can you tell me what really happened?" The little girl hesitated, looking at Isabella with palpable fear before finally speaking in a trembling voice. "I was just helping to clean the living room, like I always do when Mom comes to work with Mrs. Isabella. But when I heard a loud noise from the TV, I got scared, and when I turned around quickly, I knocked the vase over by accident." "Her lie," Isabella snapped, interrupting. "I saw her playing with it like a microphone. These children don't understand the value of things." Derek ignored her, focusing entirely on Emilia. "What noise did you hear on the TV?" he asked kindly. "A lady yelling very loudly at a little girl," Emilia whispered, her voice barely audible. "The lady said very mean things to the girl." Derek's heart clenched, but he kept his voice calm. "What did she say, sweetie?" Emilia hesitated, her eyes darting to Isabella, her fear growing. Like the way Mrs. Isabella talks to me when Mom isn't here, Emilia whispered. Derek felt his spine stiffen as the words sank in. What does Mrs. Isabella say? Derek pressed gently, his voice a soothing balm despite the rage bubbling inside him. Emilia swallowed, her tiny hands wringing together. She says that if I tell anyone, Mom will lose her job, and we won't have money for food. She says people like us should be grateful to be here, that we should never cause trouble. Derek's blood ran cold. The words rang in his ears, and everything he thought he knew about his wife shattered. He turned his gaze toward Isabella, who now appeared uncomfortable and on edge. People like you, Derek repeated slowly, his voice controlled. What do you mean by that? Emilia looked up at him, her large brown eyes filled with a mixture of fear and caution. She hesitated before speaking again, her voice small. People like us, people our color. Derek's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to remain composed. The silence that followed hung heavily in the room, thick with unspoken truths. Isabella seemed to realize she was losing control of the situation, and her smile faltered. This is a misunderstanding, she said quickly, her voice high-pitched with an edge of panic. I'm just trying to teach her about boundaries and respect. Carmen, Emilia's mother, is a fantastic employee, but she sometimes lacks supervision when Emilia is around. Derek studied Isabella's face, his mind racing. He now saw how carefully she had manipulated everything, how she had subtly instilled fear into this little girl. What boundaries? Derek asked quietly, his tone now hard and sharp. Respect for property? Knowledge of their place in this world. Isabella's eyes flickered for a moment, but she recovered quickly. Exactly, she said with a calm that barely masked the venom beneath. It's essential for children like Emilia to know their place. We're doing them a favor by showing them how to respect their betters. Derek's stomach churned at her words. And what is that place exactly? He asked, his voice like ice. Their place is to understand their role. People like Carmen and Emilia need to know that they can never expect the same opportunities as those of us who have earned everything we have. Isabella said this with such conviction that Derek's mind reeled. This was the woman he had married. This was the woman he had trusted. Derek's mind was a whirlwind of realizations, none of them good. He realized he had married a woman who saw herself as superior, who believed in social hierarchies that had no place in the modern world. His heart burned with betrayal as he looked at Isabella. And you've been teaching Emilia this for the past 3 years? Derek's voice was a low growl. You've broken her down bit by bit, made her believe that she is less than everyone else in this house. And now you're justifying it with this twisted lesson in hierarchy. Isabella stood tall, her face flushed with indignation. You don't understand, Derek. It's the real world. If we let these people think they can be anything other than what they are, we're doing them a disservice. Derek shook his head slowly, disbelief still clouding his mind. No, Isabella. What you've been doing is cruelty. And it stops now. The weight of his words landed heavily in the room, but Isabella wasn't done. She straightened, trying to regain control. And what, Derek? You're going to turn our house upside down because of one little incident, she sneered. Derek's eyes locked onto hers, his expression stone cold. I think it's about time I paid attention to what's been happening here, he said slowly. And with those words, he made his first decisive step toward a future where Isabella's reign of psychological torment would finally end. Derek could feel the weight of his decision bearing down on him as he stepped away from Isabella and toward the kitchen. He found Maria and Emilia sitting together at the table, speaking in low whispers. When Maria saw him, she straightened, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. Mr. Derek, she began, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Derek held up his hand, signaling her to stop. Maria, no one is in trouble, he said softly, kneeling down beside her and taking Emilia's hand in his. I just need to understand everything. I need to know what's been happening when I'm not here. Maria's eyes flickered toward the living room, her expression filled with anxiety. Mr. Derek, please, we don't want any trouble. Mrs. Isabella is very powerful in this house. We need this job. Derek could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that Emilia had been showing, and it broke his heart. What happened, Maria? I need to know everything. Maria looked at her daughter, then back at Derek, her shoulders slumping in resignation. It's been like this for a long time, Mr. Derek. Mrs. Isabella, she's been hard on Emilia. She'd say things, threaten her, make her feel less than the other children here. She'd call her names, say things about her being, well, you know. Maria hesitated, glancing down at Emilia, who was still clutching her hand tightly. She'd tell her that she was lucky to even be allowed in the house, that if she didn't behave, she'd lose everything. Emilia spoke up then, her voice shaking but resolute. She told me that I had to know my place, she whispered, and that if I didn't, we'd lose everything. She said I'd never be anything more than the help. Derek's heart clenched as he heard the words. No child, especially one as bright and full of promise as Emilia, should ever have to carry such burdens. He looked at her, trying to offer reassurance with his eyes. Emilia, he said softly, you don't ever have to feel like that again. I promise. The small girl blinked up at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, but there was a glimmer of hope in them too. Do you really mean it, Mr. Derek? She asked, her voice barely audible. Derek nodded, his resolve hardening. I do, Emilia. No one will ever make you feel like that again. Derek stood up, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He felt disgusted by what had been happening right under his nose for years, but there was a sense of clarity, too. He had known something was wrong. Something had never felt quite right, but he had allowed himself to be distracted by the comforts of his wealth and status. That was over now. He wasn't just going to turn a blind eye anymore. He couldn't. Not when a child had been hurt. Not when he had the power to stop it. Maria, he said quietly, his voice firm with determination, we need to protect you and Emilia. We need to make sure she's safe. Maria nodded, tears welling up in her eyes as she clutched her daughter's hand. Thank you, Mr. Derek, she whispered. You don't know how much this means to us. Derek gave her a brief smile before turning to leave the kitchen. As he passed the living room, he glanced at Isabella, who was now pacing nervously, her face a perfect mask of feigned concern. He wasn't fooled by it anymore. She had underestimated him, thinking that he would never find out what was really going on. But now, the game was over. Isabella, Derek called out, his voice calm, but with a sharp edge. She froze and turned toward him, her eyes wide with surprise, though she quickly masked it with a smile. Derek, darling, she said, her tone too sweet. We really need to talk about this situation. Derek didn't wait for her to continue. We've already talked, Isabella, he said, his voice low but full of authority. And now, I think it's time for the truth to come out. Isabella's smile faltered for a moment, and Derek could see her calculating, trying to figure out how to manipulate the situation. But it was too late. I know what's been going on here, Derek continued, his voice unwavering. And I'm going to make sure it stops. No more threats. No more intimidation. This house will be a safe place for everyone, starting right now. Isabella opened her mouth to protest, but Derek held up a hand. I've already called a lawyer. We'll be getting everything documented. And if necessary, I'll take further action. For the first time, Isabella seemed genuinely rattled. You can't do this, Derek, she spat, her voice now laced with venom. You'll ruin everything. Derek didn't flinch. I'll ruin nothing, Isabella, he said calmly. But I will make sure that you never hurt another person in this house again. The tension in the room was palpable, but Derek felt a sense of relief washing over him. This was the right decision. It was the only decision. As Isabella's face twisted into an angry scowl, Derek stepped back, letting the words sink in. He could feel the weight of everything that had been revealed, the years of manipulation, the cruelty hidden behind a veil of charm. Isabella's facade had cracked, and now there was no turning back. But even as he prepared to follow through on his promises, a voice echoed from the hallway, startling both of them. Derek. It was Maria, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Derek turned and saw her standing in the doorway, holding Emilia's hand. Is everything okay? Maria asked, her face a mixture of worry and hope. Derek walked over to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Yes, Maria. It's going to be okay, he reassured her. He then turned back to Isabella, who was seething in the background. Isabella, this is over. I'm taking action. No one, especially not a child, should live in fear under this roof. Isabella's face contorted with rage. You'll regret this, Derek. You can't just destroy everything I've built. Derek gave her a cold smile. What you've built is based on lies, Isabella. And those lies end now. As the room fell into silence, Derek could hear the distant sound of a phone ringing in the background. He knew it was probably Isabella's attempt to salvage whatever was left of her reputation, but it was too late. The truth was already out. Later that evening, as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Derek sat in his study, reviewing documents with a steady hand. He had already spoken to his lawyer, and the process was underway to ensure that both Maria and Emilia were protected from further harm. Derek had always been a man who relied on logic and strategy to build his empire, but now he was using those same skills to dismantle the fortress of deceit that had been built around him. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how close he had come to losing everything. How close he had come to letting his own blind trust and desire for peace destroy the very people he cared about. The next morning, Derek received a call from the private investigators he had hired. They had been gathering information on Isabella's network and had uncovered a series of disturbing patterns: social manipulation, financial control, and even some subtle threats aimed at his other employees. Derek had suspected that Isabella's influence reached farther than he initially thought, but the scope of it shocked him. He knew it would take time, but he was ready. The truth was on his side now, and he was going to make sure it all came to light. He called Maria into his office, and as she sat across from him, he spoke with determination. "Maria, I'm going to make sure that Emilia gets everything she deserves, starting with a safe, loving environment. And as for you, I'll make sure you're never afraid of losing your job again." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Derek. I don't know what we would have done without you." Derek smiled warmly at her, his resolve stronger than ever. "You'll never have to find out." By the end of the week, Derek had taken swift action, ensuring that every one of Isabella's cruel actions would be documented. His lawyer, Diana, had already filed for a formal investigation into Isabella's behavior, and the first steps toward securing Maria and Emilia's future had been set in motion. The mansion was no longer the prison it had once been. Derek had made sure of that. As the weeks passed, the story of Isabella's manipulation and abuse began to spread, not just within the house, but across Derek's social circles as well. Whispers began to circulate about her true nature, and soon, the same people who had once praised her were quietly distancing themselves. Derek couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had fought for the truth, and in the end, the truth had won. As for Isabella, her world crumbled around her. The mansion, once a symbol of her power, now stood as a reminder of the empire she had built on lies. It wouldn't be long before the full extent of her cruelty was exposed to the world. Meanwhile, Emilia and Maria began to rebuild their lives. The scars would take time to heal, but Derek was there to help them through it. He had learned a valuable lesson in the process. Never underestimate the power of truth. And sometimes, it takes a great deal of courage to do what's right, even when the world seems to be against you.